Howdy, everybody. It's Sen here, and we are live with another TTGDA webinar. Now, I'm going to say that this may be a little bit weird and maybe a little bit underpopulated because it is literally the night before Gen Con. 'Twas the night before Gen Con, and all through the interweb. Maybe a lot of the people that would normally be here aren't going to be here, but that's okay. We're going to do the solo game design webinar with Alara Cameron anyway, which is very weirdly fitting. As you know, maybe we'll just be all by ourselves, and that's okay. We can sing a song from the 90s by Tiffany. So let's get started, and if people come along, that's great. Questions we'll reserve to the end. When more people come, I will note all of that and let people know how to get their questions answered at the end. But welcome to Alara Cameron. Alara is a frequent co-designer with myself. We work on lots of games, and Alara's got a really good brain for, well, many things, but aside from the other many things, specifically, is coming up with solo game modes for games that have multiplayer games already, right? So not solo game modes from the offset, but a game that will be multiplayer most of the time, but has a solo mode in it. Right? That's what we're talking about today, I think, mostly. Although I guess all the principles do apply for, or many of the principles will probably apply for making a solo game. Alara, why don't you introduce yourself some more?
Great. Thanks, Anne. Yeah, hi, I'm Alara Cameron. Who am I? My first published game, first singly published game was Legend of Korra Pro Bending Arena all the way back in 2018, before the world changed. And Since then, I've been professionally making games, usually for intellectual properties, stuff like Batman, Kingdom Rush, Grendel, Lupin the Third, but also a half dozen other games that were not intellectual properties. I also do game development in addition to design. And so why am I here? Why am I talking to you about solo games? Well, Sen alluded to it a little bit. I often create solo modes for the games I'm a designer of. So Kingdom Rush is an example of that, but also games that I do development work on. Development often involves me making a solo game, a solo mode. So How to Save a Planet was a recent one, but I also did a solo mode for Rat Queens to the Slaughter, which is coming back to crowdfunding soon. Finally, I myself am an avid solo gamer. Mage Knight is my beloved favorite solo game, but also whether or not a game has a solo mode is often a difference maker to whether or not I add it to my collection. So, what do I hope you walk away with from today? I hope that you get a view of the rich tapestry of solo games that are out there. Hopefully, you come away with a short list of solo games you want to check out and learn more from, an appreciation of the different ways solo game experiences can come to be, at least one new way of thinking about or approaching solo game designs, and also I hope you walk away with answers to any questions you have for me.
Great. All right, everybody. So I'm going to step off the stage. I'll let Alara do her thing. And then around the time that she's finished, I'll come back. If you have questions for Alara during the talk, please write in the chat and put like a big like Q before it, like Q. How do you balance for multiple enemies or whatever? So that'd be great if you did that, and we will get those questions asked and answered at the end of Alara's talk. Okay, cool. And with that, Alara, take it away.
Thanks, Anne. All right. So, how's the talk going to go today? Well, first I'm going to do what I have to. I'm a professionally trained philosopher. It's a curse. And so I got to give a definition. So I'm going to start with a definition of what a solo game is. I'm going to problematize my definition and then change it, and leave that as something that you can chew on and think about and hopefully disagree with in your own way. And through disagreeing with my definition, maybe come to some new understanding of solo games. Then I'm going to start with the big question: how do you start designing a solo game? Then from there, another bit of the philosopher's curse. I'm going to give you a small taxonomy, 3 different kinds of solo games. I'm going to talk a little bit about what makes each of them interesting. And then finally, I'm going to wrap up with 3+1 tips for designing solo games. Not so much tips as things that I am always thinking about throughout the entire solo design process. And maybe they will inspire and help you. All right, so that definition. So here's where I started. A solo game is an interactive puzzle that resists being solved. And I floated this definition of a solo game to my girlfriend yesterday. And she immediately, as somebody who is an avid puzzler, challenged me by noting that puzzles and games are not the same thing. And I cannot put the word interactive in front of puzzle and make that game. In particular, she pointed out that puzzles generally don't have a win condition, or if they do, it's done and not done. Whereas games, even games that have clear winning in solo designs, solo games, not only have a win and loss condition usually, but they also have, like, they admit of grades, right? You have a score. You can win better or lose worse in one game versus another, whether there's an explicit score or the game was just really one-sided. And then also there's this, so that got me thinking about why do I want to use the word puzzle. I think it's more that I was trying to get the idea of puzzling. That's the thinking that goes into playing a game. And so after discussing this with her a little bit, I've come around to a solo game is a puzzling experience that resists being solved. I'm not sure that the puzzling experience part is right, but really fundamentally, to me, what to me makes a good solo experience is that resists being solved. So hold that in your mind. That's going to be something that I come back around to a couple of times. But also feel free to disagree with this definition, and maybe something else makes the essence of a solo game for you. And I don't know. I find as a recovering philosopher that it's very useful to puzzle out definitions. Just try not to get too hung up on coming up with the right one, because they're never fully right. All right. So from there, we can move on to the first question. How do you start making a solo game? Well, the really glib and obvious answer is you just make something. One thing about solo games that makes them a great place for experimenting and practicing and honing your craft as a designer is that a solo game can be play tested by yourself. And that gets past the sort of biggest barrier to game design, I find anyway, which is finding playtesters on a regular basis. With a solo game or a solo mode, you can just sit down and grind through it. So fundamentally, how do you start? You make something. If you want to get exercise, take a multiplayer game that you're fond of that doesn't have a solo mode. Try to make a solo mode for it. It can be a good exercise to like flex your solo design muscles and see what's there. But that's also true of like any game design. When I sit down to make a solo game, I'm not just going to start writing on cards and moving them around. Absolutely. But I also do market research, which I don't always do for non-solo designs. But part of the reason I do this is because solo modes are such an important part of the hobby game space that it's generally regarded as leaving money on the table to do crowdfunding for a game without a robust solo mode attached. You have a robust solo mode on your game, and it's going to bring solo gamers potentially to into the room. And so there's always heaps of new solo modes, new solo games coming out all the time, which means the area of design is always fast moving. There's always new and interesting things. And so even if it's only been 3 months since the last time I started a solo design project, I'm still going to do a little market research before I really get down to it. So what does that involve? Well, the first thing is I take a look at what solo gamers are saying. What's the solo community talking about? Not specifically the games, but how are they talking about games? How are they reviewing? How are not reviewers? How are average gamers reviewing and discussing games that came out 6 to 8 months ago? I look in the One Player Guild on BGG. I'll look at various geek lists. I will look at recent games, uh, again, 6 to 8 months old, I want to have let their popularity simmer and see how people have reviewed them. What have they provided in the descriptions on BGG for what they liked or didn't like? Our solo board gaming on Reddit is another place. Again, check in on what people are saying. And then also, what's out there? If you're new to solo game design, here's 4 games you should absolutely check out, all for very different reasons. If you're familiar with solo games, you should still take a look and see what's been popular in the last 6 months. What's new at all? And for each thing you look into, ask yourself what it does that's unique. These 4 games here, Mage Knight has stood the test of time as a solo game experience. Solo players still rave about this game, even though it feels like, at least as far as the industry is concerned, it's ancient, an artifact of a bygone era. Final Girl is an exemplar of a game designed just for the solo experience. It is a 1-player game with a billion expansions and is very popular. Taking that one apart and understanding what makes it tick absolutely will level up your solo game design. Marvel Champions is there because when I was scanning top 10 lists, it shows up on almost everyone's. And so it's worth understanding why Marvel Champions is so popular amongst the solo gaming community. And finally, I popped a Gentle Rain in there because it's different. It does something really unique. In my opinion, it's a slightly different topic, but Gentle Rain is the only truly cozy board game experience I have ever played. It's a solo game and it's relaxing, which is interesting. And I think that makes it worth picking apart. So study what's out there. And that's fundamentally how I get started, right? Do a little bit of market research, look at what people are saying, look at what's new, take it apart a little bit, catch up on the current trends, because this area of design is always rapidly evolving. There's always something new and cool that has happened in the last 3 months, if you know where to look for it. Okay, so you've gotten started, or you're thinking about getting started. The next thing I had promised was a bit of a taxonomy, a little bit of a framework. So I'm going to propose that there are 3 different broad categories of solo game, kind of based on where they come from. First of all, there's cooperative games. It's a bit cheeky, but every cooperative game, whether it's intended to be or not, that doesn't have information or communication sharing restrictions is a solo game, even if a player needs to play it multi-handed. My first experience with solo board gaming was Pandemic. I loved the game. I wanted to play it way more than my friends did, so I started playing it 4-handed solo. I'd set up a 4-player game and play it by myself. I just do every roll. And in that way, every co-op game that doesn't limit communication is a solo game. Now, most co-op games recognize this, and so the designers will build one player into it on purpose. 2 ways that can be handled. Games like Spirit Island scale down to 1 player. It's just whatever the scaling system for the game is for player count, it works down to 1. And so it's the same game, 1 to 4 or 5 or whatever the game is, but it's possible to play it by yourself. Some cooperative games like Kingdom Rush, I needed to add something extra to it. The cooperative game itself has mechanics that make players interact in interesting ways, and it wouldn't feel like Kingdom Rush, not the intended experience, if you didn't have something like that going on. So to make the solo rules work, I had to build in some extra rules complications to approximate kind of what happens when you have a friend sitting across the table from you. And so it's not quite a full-blown solo mode, but it is a solo variant. Okay. The next type of solo game is a true solo game. So these are games that are designed explicitly for 1 player. Examples are Gloomhaven, Button and Bugs, Warp's Edge, Under Falling Skies. I talked about Final Girl already and A Gentle Rain. These games offer only a solo experience. And any of them that are popular must be good exemplars of what the solo gaming community enjoys. And so they're good examples of excellent solo design. And finally, as Sen had mentioned, the kind of games that I tend to make, competitive solo modes. So these are games that include a solo variant or mode that are otherwise designed for 2 or more players, competitive. Like a human player is going to win the game. They're not cooperative. We're not working together. It's me versus you. But then the solo mode still has to somehow capture that essence. So what makes it different from the other two is that the way that the game resists the player needs to feel like or capture something about what it's like to play that game against other humans. Additionally, it needs to feel like the game that it was built from. There's like an extra sort of design restriction. A game like Warp's Edge is a true solo game. You just feel like Warp's Edge. It doesn't have, the designers had some intent about making it feel like the theme, but the solo game experience stands on its own. When you make a solo mode for a game like Grendel or Lost Ruins of Arnak, your solo design is going to be partly evaluated based on it feeling like playing those games against other people at least a little bit. And so it has a bit of an extra challenge to it from a design perspective. Now, with all that in mind, what can you learn from these different types of solo games? What's the point of this taxonomy, Alara? Well, the point is that tied to the sort of market research thing, you can learn different things from each of these different kinds of design. That's why I group them out the way that I do. For true solo games, they're a great place to figure out the essence of what makes a solo experience engaging and fun. They've got nothing else to offer. And so dissecting them is easier. You don't have to try and figure out how the solo is evolving out of a competitive experience or how the multiplayer experience and the one-player experience differ. It is just what it is, a solo game. So they're a great place to start, picking apart solo modes and understanding what makes something great. For cooperative games, they're a great place to go if what you're struggling with is making an engaging, puzzly experience. Good cooperative games present challenging puzzles for players to ponder, whether solo or with friends. And so you can go look at cooperative games with solo modes if where you're stuck or having or needing some inspiration is on that puzzly element. How do I make this engaging to think about? Additionally, cooperative games that have solo variants, like Kingdom Rush, can be a good place to get ideas for spicing up a solo game by seeing what the designers did to enhance the solo experience to bring it up to the multiplayer experience, right? The power of friendship kind of thing. In the case of Kingdom Rush, it's, the game adds benched heroes, which are essentially like once per game Marvel vs. Capcom tag move style airstrikes that compensate for not having an actual human teammate. And so that the kind of a thing that you could add, big flashy superpowers that are limited in a way, is what that game does. Finally, competitive solo modes are a great place to learn about different or discover or get ideas for different approaches to resisting the player in a way that feels intelligible or like interacting with an opponent. Because that's an essential part of what makes a competitive solo mode good. A true solo game doesn't necessarily have to feel like your opposition is intelligent to be good, to be a good solo experience. But a competitive solo mode to a game does. Otherwise, it won't feel like that game. And so this can be a good place to go if what you need is ideas or inspiration for resisting players in interesting ways. All right. All right. So it's a whole bunch of discussion about what solo games are and how they come together and why it's important to do market research, especially in the solo design space. And so finally, this brings us around to the bulk of what I wanted to do, was just talk about design and 3+1 things that Alara thinks about when making solo games. And maybe these will be useful for you to think about and also incorporate into your own design process in your own way. So the first thing, the big thing, I promised that we would circle back to this. I've said resist a few times, is asking yourself, how does the game resist the player? And by this, I mean, like, how does, yeah, best way is to go with some examples. Solo games resist players by being unpredictable, using randomness. This is one of the most common ways that solo games resist players. They resist being solved. They resist being won by being unpredictable. In A Gentle Rain, you have to place the tile you draw before you draw a new one, but you don't know what the next tile you're going to draw is. And so you can't play perfectly because you don't know what's going to happen next, even if you've memorized all the tiles. Grendel, which is coming out soon, is a game that I designed solo modes for. It's a big asymmetric game like Root, and every faction can be used as a solo opponent. But every single one of them has some form of randomness that factors into how that faction plays against you. What actions it takes on a given turn are determined randomly, although each one uses a different randomizer that ties into the asymmetry of that faction. And so in this way, randomization, unpredictability, the role it plays in the solo design, I frame it as resisting the player, because by resisting, I mean makes it difficult or challenging to win, to make decisions, to choose the right action. You can another way that solo games resist players is by overwhelming them with conflicting goals. So Dorfromantic can be played solo, and it's a great example of this. Because by the time you've gotten into late game Dorfromantic, you have unlocked so many different tiles and abilities and ways to score points that any given tile that you draw, there's like 6 different ways that you could use it productively. You're not going to complete every goal, not going to maximize every scoring opportunity in the game. And so you're constantly faced with this decision point of which way am I going to get points? It's one of the ways that Dorf tries to be a cozy experience. It's all about getting more points. It's just like more points here and more points there. And I say overwhelming, but Dorf isn't an overwhelming game. It's just if you sit back and think about all of these overlapping, sometimes conflicting goals, that's part of what makes it unsolvable. Right? It's not a puzzle with a clean, unique solution. It's a solo game because it's resisting you by making there be multiple different ways of usefully playing your tile. You can also block player actions. That's a way that most solo modes for competitive worker placement games work. One way or another, they're going to get in your way. They're going to tell you, you can't do this now. Oh, you didn't do that before the solo mode did? The solo opponent did? Gone. You can't take that action now. So on and so forth. Lost Ruins of Arnak does this. How to Save a Planet does. How to Save a World does this. I'm pretty sure Dune Imperium does this in its solo play. The Mistborn Deck Builder does this. It's not a worker placement game, but it does sometimes knock cards out of the market, which can mean that you're like looking at a card like, oh, I'm going to buy that. And then the solo guy flips a card and it's gone. It just takes away the card you were looking at. These are ways that these games resist players. They get in the way. They get in your way. They force you to change your plans. Another way to resist players is by the game being complex or opaque. Spirit Island is like this, especially the newer you are to the game. Thing with complexity and opacity is it's not permanent resistance. You can learn and get better at Spirit Island and get to a place where the system isn't a big, confusing, opaque mess of interactions, and it actually does make a lot of logical sense to you. But that's not how it feels in the first place. And thus, one of the ways that you can resist players is by just having the game have a lot of moving parts, and having it be really, really difficult for players to anticipate how all of those moving parts are going to Rube Goldberg machine their way into a victory or a loss. Limitations or restrictions that prevent easy, optimal play. So this is what Kingdom Rush does. I told you about the benched heroes as a way of spicing up the experience and compensating for not having teammates. But the other thing that the main Kingdom Rush game has is your teammates each have different locations where they can play their towers. And if we were just to scale down to one player, you could place your towers anywhere. And that would make the game too easy. So the solo variant for Kingdom Rush does include a restriction on where you can place your towers. And that prevents optimal play because now you've got to work with the spaces that are available to you that are changing every turn. And that is, again, a form of resistance. We identified the optimal way to beat a scenario, and then we put rules in place, limitations on the player that says, no, you cannot do that. You'll have to find another way. And again, that's a way that the game is resisting the player. Finally, the last example I can think of solo games resisting players is by the game side, and this mostly applies to solo modes of competitive games, is overpowered, cheats, or otherwise ignores game rules. How to Save a World and Grendel, two of my solo modes, are examples of this. This is actually my favorite solo design trick. And why I like it so much is related to the next two things that I always think about. So I'm going to go to those, and then I'm going to come back to this and talk a little bit more about what it means to make the game cheat, and how that can make a fun solo experience. Okay. So the second thing that I'm always thinking about when I'm working on a solo game is how can I lower the processing overhead? The fun in a solo game experience is in the decisions, not the upkeep, right? I'm having fun because I'm thinking about what I'm going to do. I'm thinking about how I'm going to respond to the way the game is resisting me. I don't have fun when I have to manage a whole bunch of tracks for the game's sake, or shuffle a whole bunch of decks of cards, or manage tokens, or do whatever it is that the game is doing in order to resist me. The more upkeep that I have to go through, the less time I'm spending having fun. And this is something that I'm always having to be mindful of. I need to avoid the trap of making a cardboard intelligence that is so clever, so well designed and beautiful, and so thoughtful and complicated, and its nested flowchart of action taking, that it takes the focus away from the player's decisions. I want, at the end of the day, players to spend as much of the game runtime, playtime, thinking and taking their own actions as possible. And that means I want them to spend as little time as possible managing the upkeep of the game or taking the actions of the solo opponent in a competitive mode. I don't want any of that processing to take more time than it has to. So, as a just flat design philosophy when making solo modes, whenever I see a way to lower the overhead, the work, or the upkeep that goes into managing the game's actions, I do it. I just do it. Oh, I can simplify that token bag into a draw from a card deck. that never needs to be reshuffled because 12 cards is enough to run the whole game. Amazing, done. Oh, I can simplify, if I think that I can simplify the action flowchart by making the cardboard intelligence more powerful by letting it cheat, done. I'll do it. It's one of the reasons why I like letting it cheat. Generally, if I'm making a solo mode for a game that involves resource gathering, the opponent, whatever it looks like, whatever the game does to resist you, will not involve it collecting resources, because that's upkeep the player has to keep track of. And so I just let it not worry about it. We just always assume that the solo opponent in How to Save a World has the resources to pay the cost of the thing that it's doing. It doesn't have to keep track of its resources. And then that way it cheats, but also it reduces the overhead. The player doesn't have to keep track of its resources. And that makes the solo experience better, even though the solo opponent isn't following the same rules as the player. Okay. All right, so we've made a game that resists players, probably through some amount of randomness, amongst other things from that list. And we've lowered the cognitive overhead as much as possible while still preserving a good, interesting, pondering puzzle thing for players to work out and interact with. How can I make the system intelligible is the next question that I ask. And this is something that's more specific to solo modes for competitive games, but still could apply to the other two categories of solo games. The reason why it's specific to competitive solo modes is because those need to feel like the game they're derived from, and the game they're derived from fundamentally is an experience of playing against other people. And when you play against other people in a game, there's sort of two parts to that. On one hand, they're going to do things that annoy you or that get in your way or that change the way that you are thinking. And that's the how does the game resist the player's question that I started with. The other part of playing against a human opponent is that you can think about what they're going to do. You can anticipate them. And so when I say, how can I make the system intelligible? I'm trying to think about what I'm getting at is, how does my solo game, how can a player anticipate what the game is going to do? Players should feel clever, and the game should feel like it has a reason for what it does. And I say feel like because at the end of the day, often the reason that a solo game does what it does is because you rolled a die or you flipped a card or some random factor said so. The rules said so. But you want that to, if you can make that feel like it's coming from a place of reasoning or planning or rationale, then it becomes something the players can anticipate. If players can sometimes anticipate and overcome the resistance the game provides by predicting how it's going to resist them and acting in advance of that, then it will feel more like you're outsmarting an opponent and not merely solving a puzzle. And so an example I have of that is a very, very on its face, not super clever approach that does exactly this, which is what I did in How to Save a World. And in that design, the solo mode is just a deck of 12 cards. It's a worker placement game. This is what the front of a card looks like. At the top, it's a worker placement action. So in this case, the solo opponent called it Simu. Simu is going to try and place a rocket ship, a worker, on a research action. If it can, then you do the action, then it gets the effect with the check mark. It's going to get some points, and it's going to multiply its points by its science. If it can't place a worker there, because all those worker spaces are already full, you've blocked it, then it's going to do the bottom effect, which is weaker than the top effect. It's only going to get 1 point, but it will get a science token. So in the future, science multiplier is higher. What this means is that if you can block the block Simu, if you can take an action before it does, then you're going to weaken its action. It's still going to do something. This is one of the ways it cheats. It always does something, even if it can't place a worker. I'll come back to that in 1 second. Why I did that, why it cheats, as I promised. But if you have blocked it, it will do a worse action than if it's able to take the action and place its worker. Okay, that's really cool. But if it's just a deck of 12 cards, it's basically random as far as the player is concerned. It could do one of 12 things. You could memorize those 12 things, but you're just dealing with the probability of what's next. Previous iterations of this, I had flowcharts and secondary decks. And again, in the spirit of simplifying down, eliminating overhead, what I ultimately landed on was doing this. Each of the actions in How to Save a World can be grouped into 3 categories: resource gaining, moving up the points tracks, and everything else. Just sort of like hard to categorize, nifty actions, buying cards, doing research, and all that. For each of those, we made an icon. And so the circle with the cross in the middle, that's gaining resources. The moon is fun actions. They happen to all be on the moon. It's going to be a moon action. And then there was another symbol for points gaining action. The back of the card is telling the player which of the card categories Simu is going to, action categories Simu's next turn is going to be. So when you see that middle card, you know next turn it's going to do a resource gathering action. And that makes it possible to anticipate. Not perfectly. There's 4 possible ones that it could take. Because of the frequency of deck shuffles, it's rare that you've seen all 3 of the other ones when this card flips. But this way the player can anticipate what it's going to do and can do a little bit of blocking of Simu. You can get in its way, just like it gets in your way. And that enhanced the experience. It feels a little bit more like playing against an opponent, because not only does it resist you, but you can also anticipate and respond preemptively to it. Okay. In 30 seconds, why do I make it cheat? Not only to reduce the overhead, but also to simplify the complexity of the cardboard system. Because it's a worker placement game, fundamentally, Simu needs to place workers. But sometimes a player will have taken that space first. So by letting Simu cheat, it's able to consistently act and keep the pressure up. What I had found was that when it didn't cheat, because it's not highly intelligent, it's not reasoning through all these possibilities and making smart choices, it's just doing the simple things that are built into its cards, letting it cheat overcomes its lack of complex reasoning. And so that keeps the pressure up and keeps the player engaged and moving forward in their own gameplay. Okay, +1, and then we're done. So those were 3 things that I'm always thinking about when I make solo games. My +1 is this: what should the game feel like to play? Anchoring to how it feels when you're playing a game. That's the experience, the emotions, sort of what it's like of playing the game. I find that helps to focus feedback into actionable changes. When I get feedback I'm not sure what to do with, I reflect on how that feedback connects to the experience of play. And that's often a shortcut to action. I also find focusing on how it feels to play, instead of focusing on things like whether it's fair, whether the decisions are interesting, but instead on how it feels, makes it easier to align theme and mechanics in a deep way. Finally, it facilitates play by ensuring that actions make sense. If you have a game where you are building roads and the action of building roads feels like the things you are doing make it feel like building a road, then all of those rules are going to hold together better in players' minds because the feelings line up with the story that the game is telling. And so focusing on the feeling helps facilitate play and learning. So these are all good things. This is a +1 because it applies to all designs, not just solo. I'm always thinking about how games feel and how players feel while playing them. That would be an entire different talk. And so instead of getting further into that, I'm just going to point you to the book that got me thinking this way in the first place, which is Hamlet's Hit Points by Robin D. Laws. I highly recommend it if you haven't looked at it. It gives a really cool framework for starting to think about and operationalize the feelings that players are going to be experiencing over the course of playing an RPG. That's the context of that book, but it can easily be translated into playing a board game. All right. And 1 minute over target time, I have hit the end. So anyway, thank you for listening, whether live or recorded. And yeah, if there are any questions, if there's anybody here, I'm happy to answer those. And otherwise, I suppose I can take questions offline too.
Yeah. So I'm here. I'm somebody. That was great. Thank you so much. I love the philosophical approach. Who would have thought that you
Me,
would have done something philosophical?
a blessing and a curse.
Blessing and a curse. So those of you who don't know, Alara and I design a lot together. So this is just normal days for us. It's like sitting listening to Alara go on and on about stuff philosophically before we get down to the work. But it makes sense because it frames it all. And it's important to understand. Like this is just like a note for like people who want to co-design or have never co-designed with anybody else. It's like get in the head of your co-designer so you understand why they say what they say, and everything becomes a lot easier in terms of like giving and receiving feedback and all that kind of stuff. Because Alara and I have come to, not come to blows like punching each other, but we've said stuff to each other where like it doesn't feel good until you realize, oh, that's why they're saying that, right? So I joke about it now, but it's really important to understand like where is your co-designer coming from. And I think that goes further when we're talking about experiential design. We're talking about like frameworks of experiential design. I like that you brought up Hamlet's Hit Points. That's a wonderful book by fellow Canadian Robin D. Laws. And yeah, it is all about the experience and the bottom line. Like I think everything you said was, well, because the experience is better if I let them cheat. Well, because the experience is better if blah 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 blah.
Yeah.
And the experience is what we're looking at straight from the top when we're thinking about things like market research. It sounds like a very fancy term, guys, but it really necessarily isn't. It doesn't have to be. It's like play some games, talk to people, read some reviews. Right?
Yeah. Make some notes. Think it through.
Yeah, be thoughtful. Start from a place of like curiosity, but also with some background knowledge in the thing, and it'll make life a lot easier for you for design. So I did ask people to put questions in the chat. Unfortunately, I think there's only like 2 people watching. So if you're watching and you want to ask questions right now of Alara, that would be great. If not, I'll ask questions, and Alara, you might have some answers to these. So I'll start because nobody's asked questions yet. So Alara, what is single-handedly like the most challenging thing to do when you're making a solo mode for a game that is competitive?
I think it is capturing the essence of player interaction from that game. So whatever, I mean, I guess you said single-handedly challenging. In worker placement games, this is straightforward because you just need to have the game get in your way, and it feels like you're interacting with it. But in any other kind of design, the competitive experience of a game involves that interaction with a person, and getting a little taste of that into the solo experience, I think, is the hardest thing to do. And
so are you saying like where the automa, whatever, however it's pronounced, automa feels like it's kind of like doing it with the flavor of a human?
Yeah, like that's, I mean, I'm part of why I framed my presentation around resisting and anticipating. I used the word intelligible in the presentation, but as I was talking it out and presenting it, I realized being able to anticipate the solo player is really the secret sauce. Getting that resistance and anticipation tuned right so that it feels like the automa or whatever you call it is interacting with you.
Hmm.
I think that's the hardest thing to do. Um,
Yeah, I find it really fascinating because and this is very game theory, by the way, everybody. This is very like, we're assuming rational actors, right? That's you have to do that when you're studying game theory, which is a thing about math and economics, not necessarily about games. But really, what is economics if not a game in and of itself? Thank you, capitalism. The the fact is that, like, yes, they have to act like they would want to win the game,
yeah,
right? And so everything has to push towards that inevitable end that we always talk about, has to push towards, them winning in a way that is rationally reasonable within the
yeah.
rules. Because you have to be able to predict it and stop it, maybe. You have to feel clever
Well,
yourself.
and it
And
has to.
yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a good way to put it. I didn't talk about it in the presentation. I thought about it, but one of the things that comes up in the solo gamer community a lot
Hmm.
is that solo gamers don't generally like high score chasing.
Yes.
Um, and so when you're making a solo game, if you're just high score chasing, it's pretty straightforward. You set a bunch of benchmarks and say, oh, if you score X, Y, or Z, then you got, level 1, 2, or 3.
Yeah, you're an
Good for
excellent player.
you.
You're a great player. You're a
Right.
fantastic player.
But that's not what solo gamers really want. They want an experience that engages throughout.
Hmm.
And so so the sort of like more general version of the balancing that resistance and anticipation so that it feels like your opponent's intelligible is creating a game experience that doesn't just feel like high score chasing,
Right.
where the game has an arc where the opponent accumulating points or the game taking your points away or health away, however you lose, the game's progression against you makes sense and is
Yeah.
something that you are able to respond to and work with
Yeah,
and work
it should
against.
feel diegetic, right? Not just
Yeah,
mathematical, diegetic. So it should feel
yeah,
of the world, of the game, of the
right.
thing, right?
Yeah. And if it
Yeah,
doesn't have that, you might as well just write down some scores in a chart at the end.
and try to get them, right? Um, I wanted to ask you, when you are making these automa, do you like personality-ize them? If that's a word, even, you know what I mean? Because I know you and I have done that in the past, where we'll sit at a
Hmm.
table and we'll play like a 4 or 5 handed game, and it's me and you, and then we make up three people and we give
Yeah.
them like little personalities. Do you do that
Yeah.
for the each of the automa?
I actually don't. Yeah, as you've noted, that's something I do to solo test multiplayer games. But when I make solo modes for multiplayer games, I don't do that at all.
Oh, interesting. I thought
Um,
you would. I really
yeah.
did.
Nope. I mean, sometimes if I'm making if the solo mode has variants, I can't remember if it made it into the final version of the How to Save a Planet one, but there was a point where I was noodling around with um, card swap variants. So there's like the base deck of 12 cards,
Right.
and then I had started sketching out like, oh, okay, if you want it to be a meaner opponent,
Yeah, put
you
this card
swap
in, take
these
this
three
card out.
cards out
Yeah.
and these three cards in. If you want it to be a high score but friendly opponent, then you swap these cards out. And so, like, it comes in a little bit when I'm trying to create variations.
Hmm.
But I can't remember if that actually made the final cut. It might not have made the final cut in the end.
Right.
But generally, no, no. I just,
So, okay, let's talk about, because this is a project that both you and I were intimately associated with, which is Grendel, which is a
Mhm.
co-design between Alara and myself. So, while I was off making the fifth faction, the fifth and final, it better be the final faction, holy cow, the fifth and final faction for Grendel, which was the press faction, Alara took it on herself to make a solo mode for each of the five factions, which were four at the time and then became five when I finished the press. Now, what you all have to understand about this is that Grendel is asymmetrical. and so each of those factions plays wildly differently. So how did you handle that, and will you ever do something like that again? And when do we say no? When do we say no that we're not going to do that?
Yeah, I had to come up with a design system for Grendel's solo modes, and then I
Mm-hmm.
applied that system to each faction. So what I did, was that the primary form of unpredictability resistance was randomness,
Mm-hmm.
and I took so for every solo opponent, I made their randomness use that faction's unique mechanic. So the
Right.
mob roll dice, and the Grendel solo opponent pulls tokens from a bag. And I mean, the tricky one was the police, because the police in the competitive faction has no randomness. It's a rondel. And so I had to inject randomness into it. So it uses there's a deck of cards that the solo player uses to target a space every round. And it's got an extra number on it that
Just
is
for the
used
police,
only for the police,
and only
because
in solo mode.
it was randomness that existed no matter what solo player you had. I didn't want to add a new mechanic just for the police, so we just tossed extra information on those cards. And like, if you're playing against the police, that information tells you
Mm-hmm.
how they do their randomness. So there's unified randomness that comes from asymmetric sources, and then I had to boil down all of the different action styles of
Right.
the factions into the same basic set of solo actions. But I still wanted to keep the vibe, and then that's where all of the magic happened in the design. I had this framework, okay, input randomness, and then output simplicity, just straight up the actions on the board that make a difference, and
Mm-hmm.
then all the meat in between, that's where they differ.
Right.
How they flow from, I mean, they differ in their randomness too, but how they flow from their randomness to taking action on the board. Um, but yeah, without that system though, that framework, I'd still be working on it.
So I wonder if when Martin came up with Automa, many years ago. Well, not really many years ago. Well, I mean, it's a long time considering, but um, they're basically like just like snapshot game state changes.
Yeah,
It's not a ton of processing, because I think that's something that you said that really stuck with me as well. Is like, yeah, eliminate all the processing, because that's no
yeah.
fun. And so, are you always trying to? Are you trying to eliminate all the processing, or just give enough so that it feels like a
Yeah.
player is doing it, but they're not
Just
really
give
doing
enough.
all of it?
I think just give enough. I think that's a good another good distinction that you've just made there, right? There's like a couple of different ways that solo games go about um, being intelligible. There's Atoma, like you said, the purest version of which is just state changes. Then there's flowcharts, the most complicated version of which is a full-on rulebook of itself, all
Yes.
of itself. And then you can do like stuff in between. So in How to Save a Planet, for example, the one example I talked about in detail, it's a micro flowchart attached to an Atoma.
Yeah.
So there's state changes, but which state change executes depends on whether or not the action space it's targeting is available.
Yes.
And so
Does
that,
it do it in a priority sequence, Alara?
what do you mean?
Like, does it say if X is available, then do this? If it's not available, then jump to the next sequence? Or I haven't played the
Well,
solo mode yet, so.
yeah, part of the solo mode on like early versions of it, yeah, that was like multi-layered flowchart. But the final version is just if if it can place a worker in the space that it wants to, it does,
Mm-hmm.
and then does A. If
Oh,
it
okay.
can't, it does B, which is, and B is always worse than A. in terms like for the solo automa, like its B effect is not as powerful as if it got to do the A effect.
Right.
And that's it. That's the right, but it's still a mix. It's still got a little bit of logic to it because it makes a flowchart decision.
Hmm.
Whereas the Grendel solos are a lot more like Automata, partly because of the way that game works.
Yeah.
Building flowcharts into the system organically is I couldn't figure out how to do it.
I don't. I don't think it's there's too many decision points that would be. You could do it, but it would end up being ridiculous.
Right. And
Like
so
to
I
the
ended
point of
up
absurdity, right? Like that's the
right.
problem.
And so that's why in that game I took the approach of making the solo opponents um, not very smart, but also overpowered. They
Yeah.
cheat to compensate for the fact that they're not very smart. So they overwhelm the player with board presence and not conflicting goals. Although in a way, taking out its board presence is a goal.
Yes.
Um, so yeah, they overwhelm the players instead of being smart in any way. Whereas the How to Save a Planet solo mode is a little tiny bit smart.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think when the system is simpler, you can be smarter, or it can enact some more semblance of intelligence, right? It
yeah,
can appear to be a little more intelligence when the system is a little simpler. And I don't mean that How to Save a Planet is a simple game. I mean
yeah.
that the decision tree is just not at all the same as a multiplayer dudes on a map combat game,
Yeah.
right? So it's just
Well,
not.
because it's a worker placement game,
Yeah.
and
and
so
and things get eliminated as opposed to
the
expanding.
the points of player interaction in the competitive game are very contrived, right?
Yes.
In a worker placement game, it's just the worker spaces.
Yeah.
Whereas in a game like Grendel, it's dudes on a map area control. So
Yeah.
the points of interaction is everywhere.
Yeah. Anything you do, something might happen, so there you go.
Exactly.
Yeah, cool. Well, okay, everybody, it is 8 o'clock. Alara, thank you
Awesome.
so much for this. We'll get the slides from you. We'll stick the slides up online along with the link to the video.
Great.
Yeah, it's Gen Con, so I didn't expect tons and tons of people. But hopefully, what we can do is, if people have questions for you, how will they reach you?
I don't know where if you're posting this video somewhere, they can leave comments and you can.
Okay, so it would be in the TTGA YouTube, and so that is like a
Ah,
private YouTube thingy.
got it.
Um, that members get the link to.
Mhm.
But maybe we can figure out a way to do something. We'll do that offline. We'll do that
We'll figure
offline,
something out.
everybody. Alara
But
and,
if you have
Alara and I
questions,
will.
ask them in the comments and we'll find a way to get you answers.
Yes. Okay. Cool. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for watching. Alara, thank you so much for your time. We'll see you all after Gen Con. Bye.
Bye.
Badunk. Thank you.